The boardroom on the 14th floor of Whitfield Properties smelled like fresh lilies and old money. 14 faces sat arranged around a table that cost more than most people's cars, and every single one of them had frozen mid-breath. Catherine Whitfield stood at the head, her platinum blonde hair pulled into the kind of effortless knot that took 45 minutes and a personal stylist. And for the first time in her 41 years of curated composure, her mouth hung slightly open. The man standing across from her wore a blue janitor's uniform. The name stitched above the breast pocket read M. Thompson. He placed a stack of documents 4 inches thick onto the polished oak, and the sound it made was the loudest thing in the room. "My name is Marcus Thompson, J.D., Harvard Law School, class of 2016. I'm specialization in federal civil rights litigation, Georgia Bar, number 47,821. His voice carried no anger, no theatrics, just the calm tenor of a man reading coordinates before a controlled detonation. "And for the past 11 months, I have mopped your floors, emptied your trash, and documented every single thing this company has done to 412 families who look like me." Nobody moved. Gerald Harrington, the building operations chief, seated 3 chairs to the left, reached for his water glass and missed it entirely. Felix Okonkwo, head of human resources, did not reach for anything at all. He simply stopped breathing. Catherine Whitfield's fingers pressed white against the table's edge. The screen behind Marcus flickered to life with a timeline stretching back 3 decades. Then the image cut to black. 11 months earlier. The apartment sat on the 2nd floor of a building in South Atlanta, where the hallway lights worked on alternating days and the elevator had been broken since before Maya was born. The kitchen counter held a cereal box, a permission slip for a 2nd-grade field trip, and a white envelope containing $62 in cash, which was everything Marcus Thompson had until Friday. He stood at the ironing board pressing creases into a blue uniform shirt, while his daughter sat cross-legged on the linoleum floor, spooning Cheerios into her mouth and talking with the rapid, breathless authority of a 7-year-old who had just discovered baking soda volcanoes. And then, bah, the lava goes whoosh, and Mrs. Perkins said mine was the biggest eruption in the whole class, but Tyler said his was bigger, but his wasn't, bah. Because mine had red food coloring and his was just white and boring. Marcus smiled without looking up. The iron hissed. Since Denise had died in the accident 3 years ago, a head-on collision on I-85 that took 9 minutes for the ambulance to arrive and 4 hours for the hospital to say what he already knew, mornings like this had become his cathedral. Maya's voice was the hymn. The cereal was the communion. And the $62 was the tithe that kept the lights on, barely, while he played the longest game of his life. He folded the shirt and set it on the counter beside a laminated ID badge that read, Whitfield Properties, Custodial Staff. Beneath the counter, hidden inside a locked toolbox pushed against the wall, sat a different collection entirely. A Harvard Law diploma, a Georgia bar card, a manila folder thick with photocopied lease agreements, denial letters, and a spreadsheet listing 73 names, 73 families, 6 years of data, all pointing to one address. Maya tugged his sleeve. "Bah, when are you coming home early? You promised." He knelt to her level, and her gap-toothed grin hit him the way it always did, like a fist wrapped in sunlight. He kissed her forehead. "Soon, baby girl. Bah promises." The word tasted like chalk because he had said it 4 times this month and meant it less each time. And Maya, who was 7 but had the emotional sonar of a submarine, tilted her head like she was deciding whether to believe him. He drove the 11 miles to Whitfield Properties in a 2009 Civic with a cracked windshield and a transmission that shuddered above 40. The building rose 22 stories over Peachtree Street, all glass and limestone, the kind of structure designed to make you feel small before you ever walked inside. Marcus parked in the service lot, pulled the locked toolbox from under the passenger seat, and opened it one final time. He looked at the 73 names, ran his thumb across the photograph clipped to the inside lid, a composite image he had assembled himself. Faces of every family, sourced from public records, court filings, social media, mothers, fathers, children Maya's age. He closed the box, locked it, and slid it back under the seat. Inside, the 14th floor gleamed like a cathedral to Capitol. Marcus pushed his mop cart past executive assistants who looked through him with the practiced ease of people who had been trained, either by culture or by memo, to treat the cleaning staff as furniture. He mopped. He emptied waste baskets. He listened. 11 months of this had taught him that the 14th floor talked freely in front of janitors the way plantation owners once spoke freely in front of the enslaved, with the absolute certainty that the person holding the bucket could not possibly understand the language of power. He was wrong about almost nothing, but he was wrong about Rosa Delgado. Rosa was 58. An accountant on the 9th floor who had worked at Whitfield since 1998. Every morning, without fail, she said the same thing as Marcus passed her desk. "Buenos dias, Mr. Thompson. Coffee's still terrible today." She was the only person in the building who used his last name. That he had noticed this on day 1 and filed it in the part of his brain that cataloged things that mattered. What he did not yet know was what Rosa kept in the basement of her house in Decatur. 6 years of printed copies of every discrimination complaint filed internally at Whitfield Properties. 73 files that Human Resources had marked resolved and then deleted from the digital system within 48 hours. Rosa had watched each one disappear. And each time she had walked to the printer, made a copy, driven home, and placed it in a filing cabinet she bought at a Goodwill for $35. But that revelation was still weeks away. Today, Marcus was mopping the corridor outside the main conference room when Gerald Harrington rounded the corner with 4 prospective clients in tailored suits. "I'm gesturing at the skyline view like a man selling heaven. We maintain the highest standards across all our properties. It's what separates Whitfield from the competition." Harrington's voice carried the polished boom of someone who had practiced authority in a mirror. He noticed Marcus on his knees near the glass partition and paused just long enough to make the pause deliberate. "Thompson, there's a smudge here. Do it again. Slowly this time. I understand this isn't exactly your area of natural expertise." Marcus looked at the glass. There was no smudge. The surface was immaculate because he had cleaned it 20 minutes ago with the precision of a man who understood that details were evidence, and evidence was everything. He nodded once, lowered himself, and began wiping glass that was already clean while Harrington smiled at the clients with the easy confidence of a man who had never been asked to kneel for someone else's comfort. The clients laughed softly. One of them adjusted his tie. In the elevator afterward, Marcus stood in the back corner holding his mop bucket. Harrington and 2 junior managers rode with him. Harrington leaned toward one of them and dropped his voice to a register that was not quite a whisper because why bother whispering in front of the furniture? People like him, You give them a uniform and a mop and they think they've arrived. DNA is DNA. You can't train out what's bred in. The junior manager's laugh was short and uncomfortable. The other one stared at the floor numbers. Marcus stared at nothing. His hands, inside the yellow rubber gloves, squeezed the mop handle until his knuckles ached. His face betrayed nothing. 11 months of this had built a callus over the part of him that wanted to respond, but beneath the callus, the nerve was still alive, and it burned. 2 hours later, he was cleaning near the mechanical room on the 12th floor when he heard raised voices through the vent. 2 HVAC technicians had spent 3 weeks chasing fault code FP2847 through the building's climate system, and the frustration had reached the point of profanity. Marcus paused, leaned slightly, and looked at the diagnostic screen visible through the open door. The schematic was familiar because he had studied the building's mechanical blueprints during his first week, not out of professional duty, but because a man gathering evidence needs to know every hallway, every closet, every server room. He saw the error immediately. Third filter from the left. It's installed backward. Both technicians turned. One of them, a wiry man named Dawson, squinted at Marcus with the expression of someone who had just heard a dog quote Shakespeare. He checked anyway. He pulled the filter. He flipped it. The fault code vanished. Dawson looked at Marcus with a new kind of confusion, the kind that doesn't resolve easily. "How the hell did you know that?" Marcus shrugged. "I read the manual." He walked away with his mop cart. But from across the floor, Rosa Delgado had been watching through her office window. She set down her coffee mug and looked at Marcus the way a person looks at a locked door when they realize they might finally have the key. That night, after Maya had fallen asleep clutching a stuffed elephant named Professor Beans, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and the growing constellation of documents pinned to a corkboard behind the refrigerator. He cross-referenced the internal data he had gathered from Whitfield against publicly available lease records, census data, and fair housing complaint filings from the previous decade. The numbers did not lie. They never do. 73 black families in 6 years had been either denied leases, charged an average of 23% more than white tenants in identical units, or pressured into leaving through selective code enforcement and fabricated violations. Every single complaint filed internally had been routed to Felix Okonkwo in Human Resources, stamped resolved, and buried within 2 business days. Not one had reached an external agency. Not one had triggered an investigation. The pattern was not a coincidence. It was an architecture. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had memorized but never saved. The voice on the other end was female, tired, and direct. "Tell me." "It's not one bad actor. It's a system. 73 documented cases, 6 years, identical pattern. Internal code I've never seen in any policy manual. I need more time inside." "You have 3 weeks. The commission hearing is April 14th. He hung up and stared at the 73 names on his corkboard. Each one was someone's mother, someone's father, someone's Maya. He pressed his palm flat against the board as if he could absorb their weight through his skin. And the apartment was silent except for the hum of a refrigerator that needed replacing and the slow breathing of a 7-year-old girl who did not yet know that the world had a word for what she was starting to feel. He locked the laptop, turned off the kitchen light, and walked to her doorway. She was curled on her side, mouth open, one arm flung over Professor Beans. On the small desk beside her bed lay a drawing she had brought home from school that day. He had not seen it yet. He picked it up and held it under the hallway light. A brown stick figure stood in the center of the page, alone. Around it, a circle of white stick figures faced outward, their backs turned. Above the brown figure, in the shaky handwriting of a child who had just learned cursive, were 4 words that split Marcus Thompson cleanly in half. "Why am I different?" He set the drawing down with the care of a man handling a detonator. His jaw tightened, his eyes burned. He had prepared for 73 case files, 6 years of data, 11 months undercover, the weight of 400 families pressing against his chest every time he picked up a mop. He had prepared for Harrington's cruelty and Felix's complicity and Catherine Whitfield's fortress of willful ignorance. He had not prepared for this. He stood in the doorway of his daughter's bedroom, and the man who had not raised his voice in 11 months felt something crack along the fault line between the father and the fighter. And he understood, with terrible clarity, that this was no longer about 73 families or a federal statute or a 30-year-old architecture of exclusion. It was about the drawing. It was about Maya. It was about every child who had ever come home with that question written in crayon on a piece of construction paper, and he was going to burn the architecture to the ground, not with fire, but with the thing they never expected a janitor to carry. The truth. But what Marcus did not know, as he stood in that doorway with his daughter's drawing in his hands and 73 names pinned to his kitchen wall, was that Felix Okonkwo had already made a phone call of his own. The morning after Marcus found the drawing, Maya sat at the kitchen table with a bowl of oatmeal she wasn't eating and a silence she wasn't explaining. He waited. 7-year-olds are not built for sustained quiet, and when they manage it, something has broken. He sat across from her, his own coffee untouched, and let the clock on the microwave tick through 2 full minutes before she spoke. "Bah, what does go back where you came from mean?" The kitchen shrank. Marcus set his hands flat on the table, fingers spread, the way a man braces against turbulence. Maya's eyes were wide and dry, which was worse than tears, because it meant she had already processed the hurt and was now trying to file it somewhere logical in a brain that still believed the world operated on rules. "Who said that to you?" "Tyler, at lunch. He said his mom said people like us should go back where we came from. But I was born at Grady Hospital, Ba. That's only 11 miles from here. I looked it up on the map in Mrs. Perkins's room." The precision of her response, the 11 miles, the map, the hospital name, was so perfectly Maya that it almost made him smile. Almost. Yet he reached across the table and took her hands, and her fingers were small and warm, and still had oatmeal on them. "Listen to me. You belong everywhere you stand. Not because someone gives you permission, but because you exist. And existing is not something anyone gets to take back." She nodded slowly, the way she did when she was memorizing something for later. He wiped the oatmeal from her fingers with a napkin, packed her lunch, and drove her to school with the radio off and the window cracked, and neither of them said anything else, because some conversations seal themselves shut once the important thing has been spoken. After drop-off, he pulled into the parking lot of a CVS on Moreland Avenue. He needed toothpaste and dish soap. What he got instead was a lesson in the taxonomy of suspicion. He and Maya had been inside the store for 3 minutes the previous Saturday, buying supplies for her science project, when a security guard began following them through the aisles. Marcus had handled it with restraint, but today, alone, he walked in and watched the same guard track him from the entrance to the pharmacy section to the household aisle, maintaining a distance of exactly 15 feet, close enough to signal and far enough, to deny. Marcus picked up a bottle of dish soap, walked to the register, paid with exact change, and on his way out, stopped directly in front of the guard. He held up the receipt at eye level. Dawn Ultra, $3.47. Register 2. Timestamp 9:14 a.m. He folded the receipt neatly and placed it in his shirt pocket, in case you need it for your report. The guard opened his mouth and then closed it. Marcus walked out. The automatic doors sighed shut behind him, and he sat in the Civic for a long time with his hands on the steering wheel and his forehead against his knuckles. Because the exhaustion of dignity performed under surveillance is a weight that does not decrease with practice. It compounds. 4 miles northwest and 22 stories above the street, Catherine Whitfield was conducting her Tuesday morning operations review in a conference room that smelled of espresso and leather-bound agendas. She sat at the head of the table in a dove-gray blazer that cost more than Marcus's monthly rent, her posture calibrated to project authority without aggression, almost the specific art form of a woman who had inherited a $2.1 billion company at 34 and spent 7 years proving she deserved it. Felix Okonkwo sat to her right, his tablet open to a dashboard of HR metrics that presented the company's workforce as a series of green percentages and upward arrows. Complaint status? Catherine's question was efficient. 2 words, no inflection. Felix swiped to a new screen. 0 open cases, all flagged items from Q3 resolved per standard protocol. Retention metrics are up 4%. Good. Catherine moved to the next agenda item without pause. She did not ask what resolved meant. She did not ask how 73 complaints in 6 years had produced 0 external investigations. She did not ask because the architecture of her ignorance was not accidental. It was structural. It's built on the principle that a CEO who never sees the body cannot be charged with the murder. Plausible deniability was not a strategy Catherine had learned. It was a language she had inherited from her father, spoken so fluently, it no longer registered as a choice. After the meeting, Felix lingered. He closed the conference room door and pulled out his personal phone, not the company-issued one, a distinction that mattered. The janitor I flagged last week, Thompson. I ran a deeper check. Background comes up clean, but too clean. No social media. No prior employment history before 18 months ago. Either he's a ghost or somebody built him one. The voice on the other end belonged to Gerald Harrington, who was sitting in his car in the parking garage, engine running, window down. So fire him. I need cause. The union contract requires documented incidents. I'm working on it. Work faster. Felix hung up and stared at his reflection in the darkened conference room screen. The face staring back was that of a man who had been hired by Richard Whitfield in 1996 with an explicit mandate: keep the machine running and keep the complaints quiet. And in return, you get the office, the title, the salary, and the particular kind of power that comes from being the only black man in the building who answers to no one except the person at the top. He had accepted that bargain 28 years ago. The cost of breaking it now was everything he had built. The cost of keeping it was everything he had once been. He chose what he always chose. He opened his tablet and began drafting a performance review for Marcus Thompson, employee ID 4471, on citing unauthorized presence on restricted floors after hours, a violation of Section 14 of the Custodial Employment Agreement, effective immediately. 3 weeks compressed into the space between heartbeats. Marcus moved through them the way a surgeon moves through an operation. Each action deliberate, each incision placed to reveal what lay beneath, without destroying the tissue around it. Week 1. Rosa Delgado met him at a Waffle House on Memorial Drive at 6 in the morning, a location chosen because no one from Whitfield would be caught dead eating there. She slid a key ring across the table, a single brass key attached to a piece of masking tape with an address written in ballpoint pen. My basement, filing cabinet against the east wall, bottom 3 drawers, 73 files. Every complaint HR deleted since 2018. I printed them the same day they disappeared. Her hands trembled around her coffee mug, not from fear, but from the particular vibration of a secret held too long finally leaving the body. I watched them erase those people, Marcus, one by one, like they never existed. I couldn't stop it, but I could remember it. Marcus took the key and held it in his closed fist like a sacrament. You didn't just remember it, Rosa. You preserved it. That's not the same thing. One is grief. The other is evidence. Week 2. Marcus, dressed in plain clothes, a strategy that required a second wardrobe he could not afford, and charged to a credit card already carrying $4,200 in debt, knocked on doors across Atlanta. The Hendricks family in Bankhead, where Gloria Hendricks, 71 years old, had lived in her apartment for 15 years before receiving an eviction notice citing a building code violation that an independent inspector later found to be fabricated. The Washingtons in Vine City, a young couple denied a lease 3 consecutive times, despite a credit score of 740 and combined income of $87,000, while a white couple with a score of 680 and lower income was approved for the same unit the following week. Sergeant Deshaun Carter, retired Army, 2 tours in Afghanistan, who was paying $1,400 a month for a 1-bedroom, while his white neighbor in an identical unit on the same floor paid $1,100. Marcus sat in their living rooms, recorded their testimonies with their written consent on forms he had drafted himself, citing Georgia's one-party consent statute, and scanned every document they had kept, lease agreements, to denial letters, rent statements, email correspondence, building inspection reports, each one a bone in the skeleton of a system designed to be invisible. Week 3. The corkboard behind the refrigerator had outgrown the wall. Marcus transferred everything to a folding table he bought at Goodwill for $12, and the surface disappeared under paper within a day. He worked after Maya went to sleep, cross-referencing Rosa's files with the tenant testimonies with the internal data he had photographed during his months on the 14th floor, using a camera concealed in a shirt button that had cost him his last $200 in savings. The pattern was not merely consistent, it was engineered. Every denial of a black tenant was preceded by an internal email from Harrington to Felix exactly 24 hours prior, flagged with the code TF7, Tenant Flag 7. Marcus had memorized the Whitfield Properties Policy Manual during his first month. Flags 1 through 6 corresponded to legitimate screening criteria: credit risk, income insufficiency, prior evictions, criminal background, incomplete applications, and reference failures. Flag 7 did not exist in any manual, any training document, any official record. It had been invented off-book, a phantom category that existed solely to mark tenants for exclusion based on the only variable that connected all 73 cases. He called the number he never saved. The voice answered on the first ring. I have enough for a civil action under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983 and the Fair Housing Act. But Catherine, it's bigger than Atlanta. Whitfield operates in 8 states. If the Flag 7 system is company-wide, we're looking at federal jurisdiction, possibly 400 families, 30 years. You have until April 14th. The commission won't wait. He hung up and sat in the silence of his kitchen, surrounded by 73 stories of dispossession, and felt the weight of the number 400 settle onto his shoulders like a second skeleton. Each digit was a family. Each family was a child who had been told, in the language of lease denials and fabricated code violations and rent differentials calibrated to the percentage point, that they did not belong. He opened his locked toolbox and took out his Harvard Law diploma. He had not looked at it in months. The paper was creased from being stored under a car seat, and one corner was bent. He pressed it flat on the table next to the files and stared at both, in the credential and the evidence, the knife and the wound, and understood that one without the other was useless. A degree without courage is decoration. Courage without proof is noise. He needed both, and in 6 days he would use both. And the building on Peachtree Street would learn what happens when the furniture starts talking. But he did not have 6 days. Felix Okonkwo's performance review landed on his supervisor's desk at 8 the next morning. By 9:15, Marcus was summoned to the HR office on the 7th floor, a room he had mopped 100 times and never sat in. Felix sat behind his desk with a manila folder and the particular expression of a man performing regret he did not feel. "Mr. Thompson, we've received documentation indicating you accessed restricted floors outside your scheduled shift on 3 separate occasions. This constitutes a violation of Section 14 of your employment agreement. You are suspended with pay, effective immediately. Please surrender your building access badge before leaving the premises." Marcus unclipped the badge from his shirt and placed it on the desk with the gentleness of someone setting down a loaded weapon. "I understand." Felix leaned forward, and his voice dropped to a register meant to sound paternal, but landed somewhere closer to menace. "A word of advice. Atlanta's property management industry is small. I know people at every firm in this city. If I were you, I would take the suspension, collect the check, and move on quietly. Some doors, once you try to open them, they close everywhere else." Marcus stood. He buttoned his jacket, which was not a janitor's uniform, but the gesture carried the same composure. "I appreciate the advice, Mr. Okonkwo." He paused at the door, and what he said next was not planned, but arrived fully formed, delivered with the same calm tenor that would later fill a boardroom. "But I have never been interested in doors that were only open for some people. I prefer to remove the locks." He walked out of the building and into the parking garage, where the morning light fell in slats through the concrete levels like the bars of a cage turning horizontal. He sat in the Civic and looked at the envelope in the glove box. The $62 was gone. Next Friday's check was suspended. The rent was due in 9 days. Maya needed new shoes. The credit card balance was $4,200. If the commission hearing was in 6 days, he called his contact. "They suspended me. Felix is going to start destroying digital records the moment he realizes what I have. We need to file the federal complaint today. Not tomorrow. Today." He started the engine. The transmission shuddered. He pulled out of the garage and drove, not home, but to Rosa Delgado's house in Decatur, where a filing cabinet bought for $35 at a Goodwill held the only surviving copies of 73 crimes that Whitfield Properties had tried to erase from existence. In the basement, under fluorescent light that buzzed like a living thing, Marcus and Rosa spread the files across her husband's old workbench. It was here, buried in the oldest folder, a complaint from 1998 marked with a coffee stain and a paper clip that had rusted into the page, but that Marcus found what changed the case from a civil suit into a federal investigation. The letterhead read, Whitfield Properties. Internal memo. The date was March the 7th, 1994. The signature at the bottom belonged to Richard Whitfield, Catherine's father, the company's founder. The memo outlined a tenant prioritization framework using language so carefully sanitized it could have been mistaken for standard policy, except for one line, circled in pencil by whoever had filed the original complaint. Category 7 designations shall be applied at the discretion of regional managers based on community compatibility assessments. Community compatibility. The phrase was a masterpiece of institutional camouflage. 3 words that meant nothing legally and everything operationally. Marcus had studied housing discrimination law for 8 years. It's argued 2 cases before the 11th Circuit, published a paper in the Harvard Civil Rights Civil Liberties Law Review, and he had never seen a system so elegantly designed to be both invisible and total. Flag 7 was not Gerald Harrington's invention. It was not Felix Okonkwo's. It was Richard Whitfield's, built into the company's foundation like rebar, and Catherine had inherited it the way she inherited everything else, without looking at what it was made of. Rosa stood beside him, reading over his shoulder. My God, it goes back to the beginning. Before the beginning. Before you. Before Felix. Before Catherine. This company was built on it. Marcus placed his palm flat on the memo, feeling the texture of 30-year-old paper against skin, and the weight of 400 families pressed upward through his hand and into his chest. And in 5 days, every single person in that boardroom is going to read this page. He photographed the memo, backed it up to 3 separate encrypted drives, and placed the original in a fireproof document bag Rosa produced from her closet. Then he sat at her kitchen table and drafted in longhand a formal complaint to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, citing violations of the Fair Housing Act, 42 U.S.C. Section 3604 and Section 3605. Across 8 states and 3 decades, supported by 73 witness files, internal corporate documents, audio recordings obtained under Georgia's one-party consent law, statistical analysis of rental pricing disparities, and one handwritten memo from a dead man who had designed an engine of exclusion so efficient that it ran for 30 years without anyone outside the building ever hearing it turn. That night, back in the apartment on the 2nd floor where the hallway lights worked on alternating days, Marcus sat on the edge of Maya's bed. She was already under the covers, Professor Beans tucked against her chin, her volcano project drying on the desk beside a new drawing she had made that afternoon. This one showed 2 stick figures, one brown and one brown, holding hands under a yellow sun. No circle of turned backs. Just sky. Bah, where are you going tomorrow? To fix something that's been broken a very long time. Like when you fixed my volcano after Tyler knocked it over? He almost laughed. Like that, but bigger. She reached up and put her palm against his cheek, a gesture she had inherited from Denise, who used to do the same thing when she wanted Marcus to stop thinking and start listening. You're gonna do good, Ba. Mama always said you were the bravest person she knew. His throat closed. He covered her hand with his and held it there, her small palm against his face. And the apartment was quiet except for the refrigerator and the sound of a man trying very hard not to cry in front of his daughter. He kissed her forehead, turned off the light, and closed the door halfway, because she liked it halfway, never fully open and never fully shut. A preference that struck him tonight as the most profound architectural principle he had ever encountered. He returned to the kitchen table. The federal complaint was sealed and addressed. When the evidence binders were stacked and labeled, Rosa's files were backed up and secured. The commission hearing was in 5 days. He placed his hand on the stack of documents and felt the heat of them, not physical heat, but the accumulated warmth of 400 lives pressing against the paper from the other side, asking to be heard. He looked at the photograph of Denise on the wall. She was laughing in it, caught mid-turn at a barbecue in her mother's backyard, her eyes half closed and her mouth wide open, and she was so alive in that frame that the stillness of the apartment felt like an act of violence against her memory. "Tomorrow, everything changes," he said to no one, or to Denise, or to the 73 names on his wall, or to the 400 he had not yet met. His voice was steady. His hands were still, while the documents waited on the table like ammunition arranged by a man who had learned that the most dangerous weapon in America is not a gun. It is a filing. And 5 days from now, in a boardroom that smelled of lilies and old money, he would prove it. 5 days later, Marcus Thompson walked into the Whitfield Properties headquarters for the last time. He carried a leather satchel that Rosa had lent him, the one her late husband used for teaching night classes at Morehouse, and inside it were 4 evidence binders, 3 encrypted USB drives, the original 1994 memo in its fireproof sleeve, and a single photograph of Maya that he had slipped into the front pocket that morning without knowing exactly why, only that he needed her close to something that mattered. When the security desk waved him through because the federal marshals standing behind him had already made the relevant phone calls, his building badge had been deactivated 5 days ago, but the court order in the marshal's hand overrode every lock in the building, a fact that would have amused Marcus if he were a man inclined toward irony. He was not. He was inclined toward precision, and the precision of this moment had been calibrated across 11 months of mopping floors, 3 weeks of gathering testimony, and 1 night at a kitchen table drafting a complaint that would reach the desk of the Attorney General's office before Catherine Whitfield finished her morning espresso. The elevator carried him to the 14th floor. The doors opened onto the corridor he had cleaned 1,000 times. Homais and the executive assistants who had looked through him for nearly a year now looked at him directly, because a black man in a janitor's uniform flanked by 2 federal marshals is not furniture. He is an earthquake wearing a name tag. The boardroom doors were already open. Catherine Whitfield stood at the head of the table conducting what she believed was a routine quarterly review. 14 board members sat in their assigned seats. Gerald Harrington occupied his usual chair to the left, reviewing property acquisition reports. Felix Okonkwo sat to Catherine's right with his tablet open, the dashboard of green arrows and upward percentages glowing like a lie told in color. Marcus entered. The marshals remained at the door. The room registered his uniform before his face, as the confusion rippled outward from Catherine's expression like a stone dropped in still water. "This is a closed meeting. Who authorized?" Marcus set the satchel on the table and unzipped it with the unhurried discipline of a man who understood that speed was the enemy of impact. He removed the first binder, placed it in front of Catherine, and spoke in a voice that filled every corner of the room without rising above the volume of a conversation between 2 people who respected each other. "My name is Marcus Thompson, J.D. Harvard Law School, class of 2016, Georgia Bar, license number 47821, specialization in federal civil rights litigation. For the past 11 months, I have been employed as a custodial worker in this building. This morning, I filed a formal complaint with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and the Department of Housing and Urban Development on behalf of 73 families in the Atlanta metropolitan area, with anticipated expansion to 8 additional states. He opened the binder. The first page was a map of every Whitfield property in Georgia, each one marked with a red dot for every family affected. The map looked like it was bleeding. Binder 1 contains 73 individual case files documenting systematic racial discrimination in tenant screening, lease pricing, and eviction practices conducted by this company between 2018 and 2024. Each case is supported by tenant testimony recorded under Georgia's one-party consent statute, internal company documents obtained during my employment, and statistical analysis showing that black tenants were charged an average of 23% more than white tenants for identical units across 14 properties. He placed the second binder in front of Gerald Harrington, who had stopped breathing. Binder 2 contains 147 internal emails between Mr. Harrington and Mr. Okonkwo utilizing an off-book classification designated Tenant Flag 7, a category that does not appear in any official Whitfield policy manual and which was applied exclusively to black applicants and tenants. Every Flag 7 designation was followed by a lease denial, a rent increase, or an eviction proceeding within 30 days. The statistical probability of this correlation occurring by chance is less than 1 in 14 million. The third binder landed in front of Felix, who had closed his tablet and was staring at the table surface as though trying to fall through it. Binder 3 contains the original 73 complaint files that were submitted to Human Resources between 2018 and 2024, each marked resolved and deleted from the company's digital system within 48 hours. These copies were preserved by an employee who understood that erasing a complaint does not erase the harm. It only erases the evidence. She kept both. Marcus paused. He reached into the satchel and removed the fireproof sleeve. From it, he withdrew a single sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges, bearing a coffee stain and a rusted paper clip mark, and placed it in the center of the table where everyone could see it. This is an internal memorandum dated March 7, 1994, signed by Richard Whitfield, the founder of this company. It establishes what it calls a tenant prioritization framework based on, and I quote the only 3 words that matter, community compatibility assessments. This is the origin of Flag 7. It predates every person in this room except the name on the letterhead. This company was not corrupted. It was constructed. Catherine Whitfield reached for the memo. Her fingers hovered over her father's signature, and Marcus watched something collapse behind her eyes, not defiance, but the architecture of a belief she had maintained for 7 years, the belief that she had inherited a company, not a crime. She picked up the memo and read it twice. And the second reading was slower than the first, because the second reading was not for comprehension. It was for grief. I want to see everything. Her voice was low and stripped of its boardroom cadence, and it belonged to a woman, not a CEO. All of it. Gerald Harrington stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is absurd. This man is a janitor who... Sit down, Mr. Harrington. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Or I will ask the marshals at the door to help you sit down, and then I will play the recording from the elevator on March 14th, in which you explained your views on genetics to your colleagues while I stood 3 feet behind you holding a mop. The choice is yours, but I would encourage you to make it quickly, because the next words out of my mouth involve the phrase federal indictment. Harrington sat. Felix Okonkwo rose from his chair and moved toward the side exit without speaking. He opened the door and found 2 FBI agents standing in the hallway, their badges already visible. Mr. Okonkwo, we need to speak with you regarding potential charges of evidence tampering and conspiracy to violate the Fair Housing Act. Felix looked back at the boardroom one final time, and his gaze landed on Marcus, and what passed between them was not hatred, but recognition. The look of a man seeing the road he did not take reflected in the face of the man who took it. The marshals escorted him out. The door closed softly. The boardroom was quiet. Catherine Whitfield stood and addressed the board. She spoke without notes, without her communications team, without the language of liability management. I am directing full cooperation with the federal investigation, effective immediately. I am requesting the board authorize an independent audit of all tenant practices across every Whitfield property in 8 states. And I am personally funding a restitution process for every family identified in these files, not because our lawyers recommend it, because 73 families in this city were harmed under my name, and the minimum I owe them is the truth I should have demanded years ago. 6 months dissolved into a montage of consequence and repair. Gerald Harrington was terminated and indicted on 12 counts of federal housing discrimination. Felix Okonkwo pleaded guilty to evidence tampering and received 36 months. The DOJ opened a multi-state investigation that ultimately identified 412 affected families across Whitfield's portfolio. A federal judge approved a $31 million settlement, the largest Fair Housing Act recovery in Georgia's history. Rosa Delgado received the National Whistleblower Protection Award at a ceremony in Washington, D.C. She held the plaque with both hands and told the audience, her voice steady as a woman who had carried a secret for 6 years and finally set it down. Courage is not always a shout. Sometimes it is a filing cabinet and a $35 trip to Goodwill. Catherine Whitfield dismantled the Flag 7 system, hired an independent civil rights compliance director, and established the Whitfield Family Restitution Fund. She met Marcus once more in the lobby of the building where he had once mopped floors, and she did not ask for forgiveness. She asked for time. Marcus told her that time was not his to give. Actions have their own clock. Start it. Marcus Thompson resigned from undercover work and accepted a visiting lectureship at Emory University School of Law, teaching a seminar he designed himself, Structural Discrimination and Federal Remedies. His first class had 47 students. 12 of them were the children of families from the case. 1 year later, Maya Thompson, age 8, stood in front of a panel of judges at the Dunbar Elementary School Science Fair. Her project was mounted on a trifold board decorated with charts, graphs, and hand-drawn diagrams. The title, written in her careful new cursive across the top, read, "How Systems Work and How They Break." She explained feedback loops, structural failures, and corrective mechanisms to 3 adults who listened with the particular attentiveness of people who suspect they are witnessing someone's origin story. She won 2nd place. She told Marcus she would have won first if her bar graph had been straighter, and he told her the bar graph was perfect, and they argued about it all the way to the car in the tone of 2 people who loved each other so completely that even disagreements were a form of music. On a Saturday in October, Marcus drove Maya to Tybee Island, 18 miles east of Savannah, where the Atlantic rolled onto sand the color of brown sugar and the horizon held nothing but distance. Maya ran toward the water, shoes off, arms wide, chasing the foam line with the absolute commitment of a child who has not yet learned to calculate risk. Marcus stood at the tide line with Denise's photograph in his hand, the one from the barbecue where she was laughing with her mouth open and her eyes half shut, and he held it against his chest for a long moment before sliding it back into his pocket, not because he was letting go, but because he was carrying her forward. Maya turned and shouted over the crash of a wave, "Bah, it's so big!" He kicked off his shoes and ran toward her, and the water was cold, and the sand gave way beneath his feet, and his daughter's laughter scattered across the surface of the ocean like something that could not be contained, and he understood with the clarity that only arrives after a man has walked through the longest year of his life and come out the other side holding something heavier than evidence and lighter than grief, that this was the verdict. Not the $31 million, not the indictments, not the federal investigation or the settlement or the reform. This, a father and his daughter standing in the Atlantic, free. Text appeared against the fading image. Since the Whitfield Properties case, the Fair Housing Act has been strengthened in 3 states. 412 families have received restitution. The Department of Justice has opened investigations into 6 additional property management corporations using similar screening systems. Marcus Thompson is currently an associate professor at Emory University School of Law. He has argued 4 cases before the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. His seminar has a wait list. Maya Thompson received 2nd place at the Dunbar Elementary Science Fair. She maintains it should have been first,